This 1546 portrait of Princess Elizabeth hides a secret. Forensic analysts spotted male bone structure in the face. The artist saw something he tried to feminize with paint. Modern X-ray analysis revealed what's underneath. And the proof changes everything we know about England's Virgin Queen. In 1546, 13-year-old princess sat for a portrait that should have been destroyed centuries ago. This wasn't just another royal painting commissioned to show wealth and status to foreign courts or to document the Tudor family line. This was a moment captured on canvas that art historians have spent hundreds of years trying to explain away, dismiss, or simply ignore because what it shows is too disturbing to acknowledge. The portrait shows Princess Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII, recently returned from her mysterious stay in the countryside village of Bisley, where local legend claims something terrible happened during the plague. Unlike the carefully controlled images she would later commission as queen, where every detail was scrutinized and approved before paint ever touched canvas, this early portrait captured something she hadn't yet learned to hide. The painter William Scrots was brought in from outside the established royal circle specifically for this commission. He was a Flemish master, trained in the sophisticated portrait techniques of the Netherlands, known for capturing exact likenesses with almost photographic accuracy. He painted what he saw sitting in front of him without understanding the implications of what his brush was recording. And what he saw has disturbed forensic art analysts ever since they started examining Tudor portraits with modern scientific methods in the late 20th century. The features staring back from that canvas don't match any other woman painted in 16th century England. They don't match the proportions, the bone structure, or the physical characteristics that define female adolescence. When forensic facial reconstruction experts, the same specialists who help police identify bodies and solve cold cases, examined high-resolution scans of this portrait in the early 2000s, they noticed something that made them question everything they thought they knew about England's most famous queen. The face looking back at them showed skeletal features that shouldn't be there on a 13-year-old girl. Features that indicated biological maleness captured in paint before anyone realized how dangerous that truth would become. The 1546 portrait hangs today in the royal collection, displayed among dozens of other Tudor paintings that show kings, queens, nobles, and their children in all their jeweled magnificence. Thousands of visitors walk past it every single day in museums and exhibitions, without noticing what makes it fundamentally different from every other portrait in that gallery. They see expensive clothing, the elaborate jewelry that marked royal status, the formal pose that indicated noble breeding, and they move on to the next painting without understanding what they just witnessed. But art conservators who've worked with Tudor paintings for decades, who've spent years studying the techniques and conventions of 16th century portraiture, admit there's something deeply unusual about this particular piece. Many are reluctant to say exactly what bothers them about it in official publications or academic papers, but in private conversations at conferences and restoration workshops, they acknowledge that something is fundamentally wrong with this portrait. The painting shows Elizabeth in expensive clothing made from fabrics that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Jewels carefully positioned to catch light and demonstrate wealth. Hands placed delicately in her lap, in the traditional pose of noble femininity that was expected of every aristocratic woman. Everything about the composition, from the background to the positioning to the symbolic objects included in the frame, screams royal princess in exactly the way Tudor portraits were supposed to. Except for one critical element that undermines everything else the person actually painted on that canvas. The physical features that William Scrots captured with his skilled brush don't align with what you'd expect to see in a 13-year-old girl, especially not one from the Tudor royal line where we have multiple portraits of other young women from the same family for direct comparison. This wasn't a case of an unskilled artist who couldn't paint women properly or didn't understand female anatomy. William Scrots was a master portrait painter who had trained under the best artists in Europe, with a reputation for capturing exact likenesses that satisfied even the most demanding royal patrons. He had painted countless women and girls before coming to England, from Flemish merchants' daughters to Spanish noblewomen. He knew what female faces looked like at every age and stage of development. So when modern experts analyze this portrait with forensic tools and see unmistakably masculine features, they're not seeing artistic mistakes or stylistic choices. They're seeing what was actually there in that room in 1546. But here's what makes this portrait absolutely critical to understanding what might be the greatest deception in British history. This painting was created at exactly the right moment in the timeline, if the Bisley substitution really happened the way local legend claims it did. 2 years after Princess Elizabeth's mysterious illness in the countryside that supposedly killed her. 2 years after panicked servants allegedly replaced a dead princess with a living boy to avoid Henry VIII's murderous wrath. 2 years would be just enough time for that replacement child to learn the incredibly complex rules of court manners, master the sophisticated role of royal princess, absorb years of education that Elizabeth had received, and sit convincingly for an official portrait without raising immediate suspicion. Yet it wouldn't be enough time to have developed the sophisticated level of control over image and presentation that Elizabeth would later demonstrate as queen, when she micromanaged every aspect of how she appeared in public and in art. This portrait captures someone still learning to play the part, still figuring out how to move their body, pose their hands, and present themselves as female nobility in ways that would pass scrutiny from people who had known the real Elizabeth. And the painter captured that truth, preserving it in oil and canvas before anyone in Elizabeth's household realized how dangerous that truth would become once she ascended to the throne. What forensic analysts discovered when they finally examined this painting with 21st century technology changed everything we thought we knew about the Virgin Queen. The bone structure visible in that painted face tells a story that contradicts 500 years of official history. But that revelation is nothing compared to what the details reveal. Because when you start looking closely at the specific features Scrots painted, when you compare them to what we know about male versus female skeletal development, when you measure the proportions against confirmed portraits of Tudor girls the same age, the evidence becomes overwhelming and undeniable. What happens when you apply modern forensic facial analysis to a painting from 1546? You get answers that Tudor courtiers couldn't have articulated with scientific precision, but might have sensed instinctively when they looked at Princess Elizabeth and felt something was slightly off without being able to explain why. Forensic anthropologists who specialize in skeletal reconstruction and identification can look at any face, living or dead, painted or photographed, and tell you detailed information about the bones underneath the flesh. They can identify biological sex with extraordinary accuracy, determine age within a few years, identify ancestry and ethnic background, and spot individual characteristics that make each skull unique. These experts have examined thousands of skulls over their careers, handled countless bones, studied the subtle differences that separate male from female skeletal development. And they've been trained through years of education and practical experience to see through flesh and muscle to the bony framework beneath. When these specialists were shown high-resolution digital scans of the 1546 Elizabeth portrait, without being told whose face they were analyzing or given any historical context that might bias their professional judgment, their independent assessments were shockingly consistent across multiple experts. Every single forensic anthropologist who examined the portrait identified the same masculine skeletal features that shouldn't exist on a 13-year-old girl's face. The brow ridge, that shelf of bone above the eyes that anthropologists call the supraorbital ridge, is heavy and pronounced in the portrait in ways that indicate male bone development. In 13-year-old girls, even those going through early puberty, the brow ridge remains relatively flat and undeveloped because female skulls don't undergo the same testosterone-driven bone growth that transforms male faces during adolescence. Female brow ridges stay smooth and relatively flush with the forehead throughout life, creating that softer facial appearance that humans instinctively read as feminine. But in boys entering adolescence, testosterone triggers dramatic bone development that creates that distinctive heavy brow ridge that protrudes forward, creating deep shadows above the eyes. The 1546 portrait shows exactly that masculine characteristic in stunning detail. The supraorbital ridge is so prominent in the painting that it creates visible shadows above Elizabeth's eyes, a feature that simply doesn't appear in any portraits of Tudor girls, the same age painted by the same generation of artists using the same techniques. The jaw structure revealed in the portrait provides even more damning evidence of biological maleness. Female faces, especially during adolescence when facial bones are still developing, tend to have rounded jaw lines with the mandible curving smoothly and gently from the ear down to the chin, in that characteristic feminine curve. This soft jawline is one of the primary visual cues that humans use to identify female faces, so consistent across populations and ages that it appears to be hardwired into human perception. Male jaws develop completely differently as testosterone drives bone growth during puberty, becoming more square and angular with defined corners where the jawbone turns sharply from the ear toward the chin. The 1546 portrait shows Elizabeth with a distinctly square jaw, with hard angles at the corners where the jawbone makes that masculine turn, creating shadows and definition that female jaws simply don't produce. This isn't a subtle difference that requires expert analysis to detect. When you compare this portrait side by side with confirmed paintings of 13-year-old girls from the same period, painted by artists working in the same Tudor court tradition, the contrast becomes immediately and undeniably obvious to anyone. Lady Jane Grey, painted around the same age by court artists who knew her personally, shows the soft, rounded jaw that's typical of female adolescence with no angular definition at all. Catherine Parr's stepdaughter, Margaret Neville, also painted in her early teens, has those characteristic feminine curves in her facial structure that create a heart-shaped face. Even Mary I, Elizabeth's half-sister, who was often described as plain and unattractive, shows feminine jaw structure in portraits from her adolescence. But Elizabeth's 1546 portrait shows hard angles, defined bone structure, and masculine proportions that match male skeletal development patterns exactly. Even more significant from a forensic perspective is the ratio between facial width and height, a measurement that anthropologists use to determine biological sex from skulls. The portrait shows a face that's proportionally wider than it should be for a female subject, with the cheekbones set further apart and the overall facial structure broader in ways that match male rather than female skull proportions. These aren't subtle artistic details that painters would have deliberately changed for aesthetic reasons. In fact, these are exactly the kinds of underlying structural features that even highly skilled painters capture accurately because they define how light and shadow fall across a face. And getting them wrong would make the portrait look distorted and unnatural. What makes this forensic analysis absolutely damning and impossible to dismiss is the consistency across multiple independent facial features that all point in exactly the same direction. If it were just one masculine characteristic isolated by itself, you could potentially argue coincidence, unusual female variation, or artistic interpretation that didn't reflect reality. A heavy brow ridge alone might be explained as unusual bone development. A square jaw by itself could be attributed to individual variation. But when the brow ridge, jaw structure, facial proportions, cheekbone placement, and overall bone density all indicate male development simultaneously, the probability of coincidence becomes statistically impossible. The distance between the eyes, when measured as a proportion of total facial width, using the same techniques forensic anthropologists employ to sex skulls, falls into male rather than female ranges in the portrait. The zygomatic arch, that cheekbone structure that determines facial width and is one of the most sexually dimorphic features of the human skull, shows male development patterns with the bones flaring wider and creating a broader face than female cheekbones would produce. Even the nasal aperture, the opening of the nose where it meets the skull, appears wider and more prominent in the portrait than the typical narrow feminine nasal structures seen in other Tudor portraits of women. The nasal bones themselves show masculine characteristics with a higher bridge and more prominent bone structure, creating that aquiline profile that was considered attractive in men, but unfeminine in women. Forensic experts who work regularly with police departments to reconstruct faces from skeletal remains found in criminal investigations. The same specialists who can determine sex from even fragmentary skull pieces with extraordinary accuracy use these exact measurements and characteristics to identify whether remains are male or female. And every single measurement taken from the 1546 portrait, when analyzed using standard forensic protocols, indicates male bone structure in a face that's right in the middle of adolescent development. This isn't wild speculation or conspiracy theory thinking. This is the same rigorous scientific analysis that's used in criminal investigations, archaeological research, and historical studies around the world, producing results that would be admissible as expert testimony in any courtroom. The person William Scrots painted in 1546 had the skeletal structure of a biological male in early adolescence, somewhere between 12 and 14 years old, based on the stage of bone development visible in the portrait. Look carefully at the hands in the 1546 portrait, and you'll see something that would have made Tudor noblewomen deeply uncomfortable, though they might not have been able to articulate exactly why those hands bothered them so much. Hands were absolutely everything in 16th century portraiture, especially for women whose social status and marriage prospects could literally rise or fall based on how their hands appeared in formal portraits. Aristocratic ladies were judged by their hands almost as much as their faces, with small, delicate hands indicating good breeding, refinement, gentility, and proper femininity in ways that were considered just as important as facial beauty. Portrait painters spent enormous amounts of time and effort getting hands exactly right, because hands revealed social class and gender in ways that expensive clothing and elaborate jewelry couldn't hide or fake. A noblewoman might wear borrowed jewels or fashionable clothing to improve her portrait, But her hands told the truth about her birth and nature. Artists working for demanding aristocratic patrons would sometimes repaint hands multiple times, spending hours on details that other parts of the portrait didn't require, to achieve that perfect, delicate appearance that Tudor beauty standards absolutely demanded. Every aristocratic woman sitting for a portrait knew her hands would be scrutinized by potential suitors, foreign ambassadors, political allies, and social rivals who would judge her breeding and femininity based on those painted hands. They would pose for hours while the painter captured every detail of finger length, knuckle definition, nail shape, and the overall grace and positioning of their hands in ways that demonstrated both their social status and their feminine nature. This wasn't simple vanity or excessive concern with appearance. This was social and political survival in a world where marriages were arranged based partly on portraits, where a woman's reputation could be made or destroyed by how she was depicted in art. A portrait showing masculine, coarse, or working-class hands could damage a woman's marriage prospects and social standing so severely that her family might never recover. So artists painted women's hands with extreme care and attention, emphasizing their delicacy, their soft skin, their tapering fingers, and their refined proportions in ways that clearly mark the subject as feminine and well-bred. The hands William Scrots painted in Elizabeth's 1546 portrait are fundamentally and undeniably wrong for a 13-year-old princess who would someday need to attract royal suitors from across Europe. Not slightly unusual. Not artistically stylized in some new way. Not showing individual variation within normal female ranges. Fundamentally wrong in ways that indicate male rather than female bone structure and development. They're too large for the face they are attached to, breaking the proportional relationships that artists carefully maintained in portraits of women. They're too strong-looking, with visible muscle definition and prominent tendons that female hands didn't show in Tudor portraiture. The knuckles are pronounced and create distinct shadows, with defined bone structure that makes the hands look powerful rather than delicate. The fingers are long and straight rather than tapering, thick and sturdy instead of slender and graceful, with none of the elegant curves that characterized feminine hands in 16th century art. When you measure the hand-to-face ratio using standard art analysis techniques that check whether body proportions are accurate and consistent, Elizabeth's hands are dramatically oversized for a female subject, falling into male proportional ranges. Her fingers show thick bone structure with prominent joints that create that knobby appearance Tudor artists carefully avoided when painting women's hands. The knuckles show defined bone structure that creates visible shadows and depth in ways that female hands simply don't in any other Tudor portraits of women, regardless of their age or social class. The overall impression is of strong, capable hands that could wield weapons or handle horses, not the delicate, ornamental hands that noblewomen were supposed to possess. Compare this portrait to paintings of other young noblewomen from the exact same period painted by artists working in the same tradition. And the difference becomes so obvious that even people without any art training can see it immediately. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, painted in her late teens just a few years before the Elizabeth portrait, has tiny, delicate hands that look almost childlike with tapering fingers and soft feminine curves. Anne of Cleves, criticized as unattractive by Henry and quickly divorced, still had hands painted with feminine delicacy and proper proportions. Even portraits of older women well past childbearing age, women considered unattractive or past their prime, show hands that maintain feminine proportions and delicate bone structure because that's what female hands actually looked like. But Elizabeth's 1546 portrait shows hands that would look entirely appropriate and natural on a young man just entering adolescence, not on a princess who would eventually need those hands to appear feminine and attractive in portraits sent to potential royal husbands across Europe. What makes these masculine hands even more suspicious and revealing is how William Scrots tried desperately to hide what he was painting. If you examine the portrait's composition closely with attention to how the various elements are positioned, you can see clear evidence that Scrots deliberately minimized the hand's visibility in ways that were unusual for female portraits of this period. The hands aren't positioned confidently in the center of the composition the way they would be in a portrait celebrating feminine beauty and grace. They're tucked away awkwardly, partially concealed by bunched fabric and elaborate jewelry, almost hidden in the lower part of the composition, where they draw minimal attention. This positioning wasn't the confident central placement typical of female portraits where hands were prominently displayed and shown off as marks of beauty, breeding, and social status. Tudor portraits of women normally featured hands prominently because they were considered one of the most attractive and important features to display. But in Elizabeth's portrait, the hands are pushed to the margins, minimized, treated almost like something embarrassing that needed to be hidden rather than celebrated. The rings Elizabeth wears in the portrait are oversized and extraordinarily ornate, drawing the viewer's eye to the jewelry rather than the hands themselves, a classic misdirection technique. The fabric of her dress bunches unnaturally around her wrists in ways that seem deliberately designed to make the hands appear smaller than they actually are, creating visual confusion about where the wrist ends and the hand begins. One art conservator who examined the original portrait up close during a restoration project noted in private correspondence that the hand positioning looked awkward and forced, as if the painter was struggling to find a way to include the hands without making them too prominent. The conservator wrote that it looked like the artist was trying to dress male hands as female, adding feminine accessories and positioning to something that couldn't be fundamentally changed at the bone structure level. And when you realize that this portrait was painted just 2 years after the alleged Bisley substitution, just 2 years after a dead princess was supposedly replaced with a living boy, those oversized masculine hands tell a story that the official histories tried desperately to erase. But the hands weren't the only body feature that gave away the truth. The overall body proportions captured in this portrait reveal even more about what was really happening beneath those elaborate Tudor clothes. The human body doesn't lie about its biological sex, and neither do portraits when you know what anatomical features to look for and how to interpret them correctly. In 1546, Princess Elizabeth sat for William Scrots with a body that was still developing, still changing day by day, still revealing its fundamental biological nature through the physical transformations of puberty. 13 years old was an absolutely critical age for Tudor children, because puberty was actively reshaping their bodies in dramatic ways that clearly and unmistakably distinguished male from female development patterns. Girls at 13 in the 16th century were starting to develop the curves, the hip widening, and the proportional changes that would define their adult female bodies and signal their readiness for marriage and childbearing. Estrogen was triggering fat deposition in the hips and thighs, creating that characteristic hourglass shape. Hips were widening dramatically to prepare for eventual pregnancy and childbirth, a change that was visible even under the heavy clothing Tudor women wore. Shoulders remained narrow and relatively unchanged from childhood, maintaining those feminine proportions that created a natural curve from shoulder to waist to hip. The overall silhouette was beginning to show that characteristic female shape that Tudor beauty standards prized, and that every portrait of young women was designed to emphasize and celebrate. Boys at 13 were going through completely different changes, driven by testosterone rather than estrogen. Changes that moved their bodies in the opposite direction from female development. Their shoulders were broadening dramatically as the clavicles lengthened and the shoulder joints expanded, creating that wider upper body that would eventually allow for greater upper body strength. Their torsos were lengthening and becoming more rectangular, losing the soft curves of childhood and developing the straight lines of male adulthood. Their overall bodies were developing that inverted triangle-shaped characteristic of male adolescence, with broad shoulders tapering down to narrow hips in proportions that were the exact opposite of female development. These changes weren't subtle variations that required medical expertise to detect. They were obvious, dramatic, and unmistakable to anyone who looked at adolescent bodies with any attention. Which is exactly why the body proportions visible in the 1546 Elizabeth portrait are so profoundly disturbing and impossible to explain away. The figure painted on that canvas doesn't show female development patterns at all. It shows male puberty captured at exactly the moment when those changes would be most visible and undeniable. The shoulders in the portrait are broad and powerful, significantly broader than the hips in ways that create a distinctly and unmistakably masculine silhouette that's the exact opposite of female body proportions. When you measure the shoulder-to-hip ratio using standard techniques from both art analysis and forensic anthropology, mathematical calculations that remove subjective judgment, Elizabeth's proportions fall solidly into male rather than female ranges with no ambiguity. Her shoulders are almost as wide as those of young men painted at the same age by the same artists working in the same Tudor court tradition. The clavicles, those collarbones that determine shoulder width, are long and prominent in ways that indicate male bone structure rather than the shorter, narrower clavicles that create feminine shoulder lines. The torso is long and narrow without any suggestion of the curves, the waist definition, or the hip widening that should be visibly developing in a 13-year-old girl entering puberty. The waist sits high on the body in that characteristic male position rather than the lower, narrower waist typical of female proportions. Even more telling from an anatomical perspective is the ribcage, which appears barrel-chested and deep in ways that indicate male lung capacity and thoracic bone structure, rather than the narrower, more delicate ribcage structure of female anatomy. The chest is flat and straight across rather than showing any development of the curves that would be starting to appear in a girl of 13. Tudor artists were absolute masters of painting the female form in all its variations. They understood intimately how to depict the soft curves, the graceful proportions, the specific body shapes that defined feminine beauty at every age from childhood through old age. They had painted hundreds of women over their careers and knew exactly how female bodies looked at every stage of development, from pre-pubescent girls to young women in their prime to elderly matrons. So when William Scrots, a painter known for his extraordinary skill and accuracy, painted Elizabeth with these masculine proportions, he wasn't making careless artistic mistakes or choosing unusual stylization. He was faithfully painting what he actually saw sitting in front of him in that portrait session. The clothing in the portrait tries desperately to hide and disguise these masculine proportions in ways that wouldn't be necessary if the body underneath was actually female. The dress is structured with heavy padding in the hips, rigid boning throughout the bodice, and careful construction designed to create an artificial feminine silhouette that didn't exist naturally. The sleeves are designed and positioned to visually minimize shoulder width, hanging in ways that were meant to make broad shoulders appear narrower. The bodice is constructed with extreme structure meant to suggest curves and waist definition that weren't actually present on the body being clothed. But here's what makes the body proportions absolutely damning when you examine the full scope of evidence. We have other portraits of Elizabeth from much later in life, painted after she became queen in 1558, and gained complete absolute control over her image and how she was represented in art. Those later portraits, especially the ones from her mature reign in the 1570s, 1580s, and 1590s, show a completely different body shape that was artificially constructed through extreme clothing, strategic padding, and careful artistic manipulation that bordered on fantasy. The famous Armada portrait from 1588, painted to celebrate England's victory over the Spanish invasion fleet, shows Elizabeth with an impossibly tiny waist and dramatic exaggerated curves that contemporary written accounts tell us absolutely didn't exist on her actual physical body. Ambassadors who saw her in person, courtiers who observed her daily, and servants who helped her dress all left written records describing her as tall and thin, almost gaunt in her later years, with a straight, boyish figure that elaborate clothing struggled to feminize convincingly. She was known for having narrow hips, no pronounced curves, and a body shape that remained remarkably straight and unfeminine, even in old age when most women's bodies had softened and curved. But those later official portraits show none of this reality. They present an idealized feminine form that was created entirely through artistic license and had almost no relationship to Elizabeth's actual body. The contrast is so extreme that historians have noted for centuries that Elizabeth in person looked nothing like Elizabeth in portraits, a gap between reality and representation that was unusual even by the standards of flattering royal portraiture. But the 1546 portrait shows the truth before she learned how to hide it, before she understood that her body was revealing secrets that could destroy everything. This was a body in the active middle of male puberty, developing masculine proportions that no amount of feminine clothing could completely disguise or transform. The broad shoulders, the narrow hips, the long torso, the barrel chest, all pointed unmistakably to biological maleness. And there's one more anatomical detail visible in the portrait that proves this wasn't just unusual female development or individual variation. The neck in the 1546 portrait is thick and muscular, with clearly defined tendons and a prominent Adam's apple that the artist tried unsuccessfully to minimize with elaborate ruffs and strategically positioned jewelry. Female necks, even on tall women with athletic builds, simply don't develop that thick, muscular appearance with prominent neck tendons. But male necks do exactly that, especially during the testosterone surge of puberty when muscle mass increases and the larynx grows larger. Everything about the body captured in this portrait screams biological maleness. And the timing of when this portrait was painted makes that revelation absolutely explosive and impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Here's what nobody wants you to notice about the timing: the detail that connects all the evidence together and transforms it from interesting anomaly into proof of massive historical deception. The 1546 portrait was painted exactly 2 years after Princess Elizabeth's mysterious stay in Bisley during the plague outbreak of 1544. Not 5 years before, when the timing would be wrong. Not 5 years after, when the substitution theory wouldn't make sense. Exactly 2 years after the incident where local legend claims a dead princess was secretly replaced with a living boy to prevent the guardian's execution. That timing isn't random coincidence that we're reading too much meaning into. It's the smoking gun that connects the Bisley legend directly to the physical evidence staring at us from the canvas. Think carefully about what those 2 years would have meant if the substitution really happened the way the village legend describes. A 10-year-old boy suddenly thrust into the impossible role of royal princess would need significant time to learn the part convincingly. Time to master the incredibly complex rules of court etiquette that governed every aspect of royal behavior. Time to absorb years of education that Elizabeth had already received, learning Latin, Greek, French, and the sophisticated knowledge expected of royal children. Time to understand how to move his body in feminine ways, how to speak with appropriate tone and vocabulary, how to behave as female nobility in ways that would pass scrutiny from people who had known the real Elizabeth. Time to be coached on Elizabeth's personal history, her relationships, her preferences, everything that would be needed to fool family members and longtime servants. 2 years would be just barely enough time to become convincing in this extraordinarily difficult role, learning to inhabit a completely different gender and social identity. But it wouldn't be enough time to erase or hide the physical reality of male puberty that would start dramatically transforming the body around age 12 or 13. The 1546 portrait captures that exact critical moment in the timeline. A substitute who had learned the role well enough to sit for a formal portrait, but whose body was actively betraying the deception through the unmistakable physical changes of male adolescence. What makes the timing even more suspicious and revealing is that absolutely no portraits of Elizabeth exist from before the Bisley visit. None whatsoever. Zero. For a royal princess, for the daughter of Henry VIII who was obsessed with documenting his family through art, there should be multiple childhood portraits documenting her growth and development from infancy onward. Henry was absolutely obsessed with commissioning portraits, with preserving his family legacy in paint, with ensuring that his lineage was documented for posterity through elaborate and expensive artwork. He commissioned paintings of all his children at various ages and stages of development, wanting visual records of every royal child. We have multiple detailed portraits of Edward VI, Henry's legitimate son and heir, from infancy through childhood, showing his development at every stage. We have portraits of Mary I, Henry's older daughter, from childhood onward documenting her growth into adulthood. We have portraits of Henry Fitzroy, Henry's illegitimate son, carefully painted to show his royal bearing despite his illegitimate birth. But Elizabeth? Absolutely nothing before 1546. No infant portraits showing her as a baby in elaborate christening gowns. No childhood paintings documenting her growth and education. Nothing whatsoever until after the Bisley incident and her return to court life. The official historical explanation for this complete absence is that portraits were lost over the centuries, destroyed during political upheavals, or simply never commissioned because Elizabeth was considered less important as the daughter of an executed queen who had fallen from favor. But this explanation completely falls apart when you realize that even illegitimate children of minor nobles had portraits painted during this era. Even children of executed traitors often had portraits preserved. This was an era absolutely obsessed with documenting lineage, status, and family connections through elaborately painted and carefully preserved artwork. Portraits were expensive investments that families protected carefully. The complete total absence of any Elizabeth portraits before 1546 suggests something much darker than mere loss or neglect. There were no earlier portraits because the girl who would have been depicted in them was dead, buried in secret in that Bisley churchyard. And when the substitute boy returned from the countryside, they needed to wait until that child was old enough, trained enough, and convincing enough to sit for a formal portrait that would become part of the official royal record. The artist chosen for this absolutely critical first portrait is equally suspicious when you examine who he was and why he might have been selected. William Scrots wasn't part of the established circle of court painters who knew the royal family intimately and had painted them for years. He wasn't one of the English artists who had grown up seeing Elizabeth around court. He was deliberately brought in from outside as a foreign specialist, a skilled Flemish painter with an excellent international reputation, but absolutely no previous personal connection to the Tudor royal family or their inner circle. Why would the royal household choose an outsider, someone unfamiliar with the family, for such an important commission as the first formal portrait of a royal princess? The conventional explanation is that Scrots was simply the best available artist at that moment, a master painter whose skills were superior to English court artists. But that explanation doesn't hold up when you consider that England had several excellent court painters who knew the royal family well and had successfully painted other royal children. The real reason for choosing an outsider becomes obvious when you consider the substitution theory. An artist who had never seen the real Elizabeth, who had no personal memory of what she looked like before Bisley, wouldn't notice that the girl sitting for him wasn't the same person who had left for the countryside in 1544. He would paint exactly what he saw without the context or personal knowledge to realize something was fundamentally wrong. Scrots painted a commissioned subject with his characteristic skill and accuracy, capturing the physical reality in front of him without understanding the implications of what his brush was recording for posterity. And here's the truly chilling detail that suggests this was all carefully planned. After completing this single portrait, William Scrots left England and never painted Elizabeth again. Not once. Despite being a court painter who would normally paint royal subjects repeatedly over many years, despite Elizabeth later becoming queen and requiring countless official portraits, Scrots never returned to paint her. He was paid an unusually generous sum for this single portrait, given a substantial pension that set him up financially for life, and essentially sent away from England. Historical records show he returned to the Netherlands, where he died a wealthy, comfortable man years later, never speaking publicly about his brief time at the English court, never discussing what he had painted. Was that extraordinary payment simply for his superior artistic skill? Or was it payment for his silence? Compensation for leaving England immediately and never discussing what he might have noticed while painting that portrait? What happens to a portrait that reveals too much dangerous truth? It disappears from public view, hidden away where it can't raise uncomfortable questions. And that's exactly what happened to the 1546 Elizabeth painting once she gained power and control. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558 after her half-sister Mary's death, one of her very first priorities, even before addressing urgent political crises, was establishing absolute control over her image with an obsession that bordered on paranoia and seemed excessive even by royal standards. She commissioned strict written guidelines for how she could be painted, created an approved face pattern that all artists were legally required to follow exactly, and ruthlessly suppressed any portraits that didn't match her carefully constructed idealized image. The Privy Council issued formal proclamations demanding that unapproved portraits be turned into authorities and destroyed to prevent them from circulating. Artists who painted Elizabeth without explicit permission or who deviated from the approved pattern faced serious legal consequences, including fines, imprisonment, and banishment from court. She wanted complete totalitarian control over how the public saw her, down to the smallest detail of facial features and body proportions. And that unprecedented level of control meant dealing with problematic earlier portraits that showed too much truth about her real physical appearance. The 1546 portrait vanished from public view entirely and completely. For over 200 years, no one saw it displayed anywhere. No one referenced it in written accounts. No historical records mentioned where it was kept or who controlled it. It was as if the painting had never existed at all, erased from history like a dangerous secret that could never be spoken aloud or acknowledged publicly. This wasn't normal treatment for a royal portrait. Other paintings of Elizabeth from various periods of her life remained on display, were copied and distributed, became famous images recognized throughout England and Europe. But this one specific portrait from 1546 disappeared so thoroughly that most people forgot it had ever been painted. The portrait finally resurfaced in the 18th century during the reign of George II, found in an obscure private collection so remote from royal circles that art historians still debate exactly how it got there and who had been hiding it. The painting had been kept in storage for over a century, deliberately hidden away from public eyes, preserved but carefully concealed in ways that suggested someone knew it contained dangerous information. When it was rediscovered by art dealers cataloging an estate sale, experts immediately recognized it as a legitimate, authentic Tudor portrait based on the painting technique, the materials used, the style of execution, and comparison with other confirmed works by William Scrots. But something about it made people deeply uncomfortable in ways they struggled to articulate in their professional assessments. The portrait didn't match the carefully constructed, standardized image of Elizabeth that had been enforced for 2 centuries and had become the only acceptable way to depict her. It showed physical features that seemed wrong, proportions that didn't align with the beautiful, idealized feminine queen that official portraits had immortalized in countless paintings, hanging in palaces and great houses across England. Art historians wrote very carefully worded academic papers noting the painting's unusual characteristics, while studiously avoiding any direct statements about what those characteristics might actually mean or imply. The papers described distinctive features and individual style without ever saying that the portrait showed masculine bone structure. They noted interesting proportions without stating that the body looked male. This careful academic language successfully avoided controversy while quietly acknowledging that something was profoundly unusual about this particular portrait. The painting was eventually catalogued, professionally authenticated through technical analysis, and added to the royal collection where it remains today as part of England's artistic heritage. But even now in the 21st century, it's not prominently displayed in major exhibitions or highlighted in museum presentations. It's tucked away in corners of storage, occasionally shown in smaller galleries, easy to miss among the dozens of other more famous Tudor portraits that surround it and draw visitor attention. The official catalog descriptions are deliberately vague, noting it simply as an early portrait without drawing any attention to its unique features or the forensic analysis that's been done. Museums that occasionally display it don't highlight the scientific studies or mention the masculine bone structure. They present it as just another historical painting, nothing particularly special or significant, nothing worth examining too closely or thinking about too deeply. But here's what makes Elizabeth's later portraits so revealing and important for understanding the cover-up. Once she became queen and gained absolute political power, she enforced a completely standardized image that all her portraits were legally required to match exactly. Art historians call this the Mask of Youth, a carefully designed face pattern that showed Elizabeth with soft, delicate feminine features, refined bone structure, small, delicate hands, and an impossibly perfect feminine face that somehow never aged throughout her entire 44-year reign. Every single official portrait from her queenship shows essentially the same identical face, the same exact proportions, the same carefully constructed femininity repeated over and over like copies of an approved template. Whether painted in 1560 or 1600, whether showing her at age 27 or age 67, the face remains mysteriously unchanged and eternally youthful. This wasn't how royal portraiture normally worked. Other monarchs were painted realistically, showing their aging and changing appearance over time. But Elizabeth enforced this artificial standardization that completely divorced her painted image from physical reality. And that carefully constructed face in the later portraits looks absolutely nothing like the face William Scrots painted in 1546. It's as if two completely different people were being painted, one showing reality and the other showing elaborate fiction. The later portraits show what Elizabeth desperately wanted people to see and believe: a constructed, idealized image that hid reality behind multiple layers of artistic manipulation and political enforcement. But the 1546 portrait shows what William Scrots actually saw before anyone realized how dangerous that unfiltered truth would become. The contrast between early and late portraits is so dramatic and undeniable that art historians have spent centuries trying to explain it away without acknowledging the obvious answer. They claim artistic styles changed over time, suggesting that different painting techniques account for the radically different appearance. But the same artists who painted the later standardized portraits also painted other subjects realistically. They suggest the early portrait was unskilled or inaccurate, but William Scrots was acknowledged as a master painter whose other works show extraordinary skill. They propose that Elizabeth's appearance transformed dramatically as she matured, but human faces don't change bone structure between ages 13 and 25. None of these conventional explanations hold up under even casual scrutiny. The real answer is much simpler and far more shocking. The 1546 portrait was hidden and suppressed because it revealed a biological truth that could have destroyed the monarchy and rewritten English history. And when modern technology finally gave us the scientific tools to prove that truth through forensic analysis, the establishment chose continued denial over honest acknowledgement. In the 1990s, art conservation technology took a revolutionary leap forward that transformed how we understand historical paintings. Museums and research institutions around the world developed sophisticated techniques that could see beneath the surface of paintings without causing any damage to these priceless artworks. X-ray imaging allowed conservators to see through layers of paint to the canvas beneath. Infrared photography revealed earlier sketches in pentimenti, those changes artists made during the painting process. Multispectral analysis using different wavelengths of light showed details invisible to the human eye. These technologies transformed art history as a field, revealing secrets that had been hidden for centuries in paintings all over the world. Artists' mistakes became visible. Changes, corrections, and second thoughts could be seen. Earlier compositions hidden under final paintings were discovered. And sometimes these technologies revealed truths that no one wanted to find, information that contradicted accepted history and raised uncomfortable questions. When art conservators began systematically applying these advanced imaging techniques to Tudor portraits in major collections, including the 1546 Elizabeth painting, they discovered something that sent genuine shockwaves through the normally staid academic community. The portrait had been significantly altered during the painting process, not slightly touched up with minor corrections, not adjusted for aesthetic reasons, fundamentally changed in ways that indicated the artist was trying to transform masculine features into something more acceptably feminine. The infrared and X-ray analysis revealed an earlier version of the painting hidden beneath the surface layers of paint we see today. And what that earlier version showed was even more dramatically and unmistakably masculine than the final painting that hangs in museums today. The underdrawing, that preliminary sketch artists traditionally made on the canvas before applying any paint, showed a face with significantly heavier masculine features than the finished portrait that was ultimately completed and presented. The jaw was more severely square in the original sketch, with hard angles that would have been impossible to interpret as anything other than male bone structure. The brow ridge was more dramatically pronounced, creating deep shadows that would have made the masculine appearance undeniable. The overall proportions were more obviously male before the artist systematically softened them in subsequent paint layers. You could see in the revealed underlayers where William Scrots had deliberately and consciously feminized features as he worked, making the face rounder, making the jaw less angular, making the overall appearance more acceptable and appropriate for a princess. The shoulders in the underdrawing were even broader and more powerfully built, clearly masculine in proportion, before being carefully narrowed through multiple layers of correction in the painting process. The hands were originally painted significantly larger and more prominent, occupying central space in the composition before being repositioned and partially concealed behind fabric in later paint layers. The conservator's technical report, published in a limited circulation academic journal, noted multiple extensive layers of correction and alteration throughout the portrait, with the artist repeatedly trying to make the subject appear more feminine. This wasn't the normal artistic process where painters make minor adjustments for aesthetic balance or correct small mistakes. Portrait painters of William Scrots' extraordinary caliber and extensive experience didn't make major proportional mistakes that required this fundamental level of correction. They sketched accurately based on direct observation and painted what they saw. The extensive corrections visible in the Elizabeth portrait suggest something completely different and far more troubling. Scrots was painting a male subject while desperately trying to make that subject appear convincingly female in the final image. He was fighting against what his trained eyes told him, trying to transform masculine biological reality into feminine artistic fiction. Every correction moved further from male characteristics and closer to female presentation. The underdrawing shows what Scrots initially saw and honestly recorded before beginning the actual painting. The final painting shows what he was instructed to make it look like, or what he realized it needed to look like to be acceptable as a portrait of a princess. What makes this scientific evidence absolutely damning and impossible to dismiss is that it proves deliberate, systematic deception rather than honest artistic representation. This wasn't artistic interpretation where different painters see subjects differently. This wasn't stylistic choice where artists emphasize certain features for aesthetic effect. This was an artist systematically and deliberately altering masculine features to create a more feminine appearance through multiple layers of correction. Every single correction visible in the technical analysis moved further from biological male presentation and closer to conventional female appearance. The underdrawing reveals what William Scrots initially saw and honestly recorded before he began working with paint. The final painting reveals what he was either instructed to make it look like, or what he independently realized it needed to look like to be acceptable as a portrait of a royal princess. Someone, whether Scrots himself or someone directing and supervising his work, recognized that the person sitting for this portrait had masculine features that needed to be disguised and hidden. And they tried methodically to fix it with paint, with artistic manipulation, with careful alterations designed to transform male into female. But even with all those extensive corrections, even after softening the jaw, narrowing the shoulders, repositioning the hands to minimize their prominence, feminizing the face, and making dozens of other changes visible in the technical analysis, the final portrait still shows unmistakably masculine bone structure and body proportions. The artist tried his absolute best to hide the truth, but he couldn't completely erase biological reality. You can disguise masculine features with clever painting techniques, but you can't fundamentally change the underlying skeletal structure that determines facial proportions. The person sitting in that portrait session in 1546 was biologically male, experiencing the physical changes of male puberty. The X-ray analysis proves it by showing the masculine features in the original underdrawing. The infrared imaging proves it by revealing the systematic feminization through multiple paint layers. The forensic examination of the final visible portrait proves it by identifying male bone structure that no amount of artistic correction could completely hide. And when you connect this scientific evidence to the historical timeline, when you realize this portrait was painted exactly 2 years after the Bisley incident, every single piece of the puzzle falls perfectly into place in a way that's impossible to dismiss as coincidence. So here we are in the 21st century, over 470 years after that portrait was painted, staring at scientific evidence that's been hiding in plain sight all along, just waiting for technology advanced enough to reveal it. The 1546 portrait isn't just a beautiful piece of Tudor art to be admired for its technical skill and historical significance. It's a forensic document that captures a moment of biological truth before the massive cover-up fully took hold and became institutionalized. Every single attempt by conventional historians to explain away the masculine features collapses completely under rigorous scientific scrutiny. The forensic bone structure analysis conducted by experts who identify sex from skeletal remains shows unmistakable male skeletal development in the face. The body proportion measurements match male adolescent development rather than female puberty. The hands are fundamentally wrong for any female subject, regardless of individual variation. The X-ray and infrared analysis reveals deliberate, systematic alteration designed to hide masculine features that were initially captured more honestly. And the historical timing, painted exactly 2 years after the Bisley incident, where legend claims a substitution occurred, connects every piece of evidence into one coherent, undeniable conclusion. The person William Scrots painted in 1546 was biologically male, showing clear physical evidence of male puberty in progress. Whether Elizabeth was born with an extremely rare intersex condition that gave her fully masculine skeletal features and body development, or whether she really was secretly replaced by a boy in Bisley Village as the legend claims, we're looking at scientific proof that England's greatest and most famous queen was living presenting as the wrong gender throughout her entire reign. This wasn't artistic incompetence on Scrots' part. Tudor portrait painters were acknowledged masters of their craft who captured exact likenesses for demanding aristocratic patrons. This wasn't unusual stylistic interpretation. We have hundreds of other Tudor portraits for comparison that show how these artists actually painted women. Every explanation offered by traditional establishment historians fails completely when confronted with the comprehensive physical evidence we now have available. They claim it's just unusual artistic style, but William Scrots painted dozens of other women throughout his career with perfectly normal feminine features using the exact same techniques. They suggest Elizabeth was just unusually tall or physically strong for a woman, but exceptional height and strength don't explain masculine bone structure clearly visible in skull measurements. They propose that Tudor beauty standards were radically different from ours, making masculine features acceptable, but we have literally hundreds of portraits of Tudor women that consistently show clearly feminine proportions and features. They argue that we're misinterpreting artistic conventions we don't fully understand. But forensic anthropologists who examine the portrait don't care about artistic conventions. They're measuring bone structure using scientific protocols. None of these desperate academic excuses hold up under forensic examination conducted according to rigorous scientific standards. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. The masculine brow ridge that indicates testosterone-driven bone growth. The square jaw with defined angles characteristic of male facial structure. The wrong body proportions with shoulders broader than hips. The oversized hands with prominent knuckles and thick fingers. The broad shoulders indicating male skeletal development. The thick muscular neck. The flat chest showing no female development. Every single physical feature examined independently points in exactly the same direction toward biological maleness. And the X-ray analysis proving that the artist deliberately tried to feminize what he actually saw eliminates any remaining possibility that this is just misinterpretation or artistic license. We're looking at documented proof of either biological variation so extreme and unusual it would have made Elizabeth completely unable to bear children, or proof of a substitution so brilliantly executed it fooled an entire nation for 44 years. Either way, the Virgin Queen's greatest secret wasn't that she nobly chose never to marry for political reasons. It was that she physically couldn't marry because any husband would have immediately discovered her secret on the wedding night. Her body wouldn't allow the deception to continue. And the proof has been hanging on museum walls for centuries, preserved in paint and canvas, just waiting for technology advanced enough to reveal what Tudor courtiers could see but couldn't quite explain. The 1546 portrait is a window into a truth that the British establishment has spent over 400 years desperately trying to hide and suppress. Every denial of permission to examine Elizabeth's sealed tomb in Westminster Abbey, every refusal to allow modern DNA testing that could settle this question definitively forever, every dismissal of the Bisley legend as mere folklore without any basis in fact, every attempt to suppress or minimize forensic analysis of this portrait. All of it makes perfect sense when you finally realize what that portrait actually reveals. They know. Somewhere in the highest levels of the British government, the royal collection, and the historical establishment, people know what opening that tomb would prove beyond any doubt. They know what DNA analysis would show if it was ever permitted. They know that the greatest monarch in English history, the queen who defined an entire era and transformed England from a minor kingdom into an emerging world power, was either born biologically male or replaced by a boy who learned to play the part so brilliantly that no one suspected until it was too late to matter. The evidence was always there, preserved in paint and canvas for anyone willing to look honestly at what it shows. That 1546 portrait isn't just historical art to be admired from a distance. It's testimony from the past. It's proof captured before the cover-up machinery fully activated. And it's been staring at us all along from museum walls, waiting patiently for someone to see what was really there beneath the jewels and clothing. The Virgin Queen's secret is finally exposed not through opening her tomb as so many have requested, but through the forensic analysis of a portrait painted when she was still learning to hide the truth. And now that you've seen this evidence, now that you understand what that portrait really shows, you can never look at Elizabeth I the same way again. If you found this evidence as shocking as I did, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're uncovering historical secrets that academic institutions don't want you to know. These aren't wild conspiracy theories pulled from internet forums. These are documented facts analyzed with modern forensic science by the same experts who work on criminal investigations. Drop a comment below telling me what you think happened. Was Elizabeth born intersex with masculine features? Or was she really replaced in Bisley by a terrified boy? Your theory might connect dots that professional historians have deliberately avoided for centuries. And smash that like button to tell YouTube this content matters. Because the more people who see this scientific evidence, the harder it becomes for the establishment to keep denying the truth and refusing DNA testing. The proof has been right there in that portrait for over 400 years, just waiting for anyone brave enough to really look at what it shows.